So Chris is the author of 5 books, including The Defense of Freedom of Speech, From Ancient Greece to Andrew Bolt, and The Growth of Australia's Regulatory State. So as I mentioned, we're very, very fortunate to have Chris with us today. Very glad that he could come up. I keep telling him it's really not always this cold, and we are very privileged to hear from him today. So let's have a round of applause for Chris, and here he comes.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for that warm welcome. And I'd particularly like to thank the Canadian Taxpayers Federation for the great work that I know that they have been doing, and the great work that I know that they can do to defeat policies like the carbon tax. But I am fully aware that there are more taxes in Canada than just the carbon tax, and from Australia we can see the enormously valuable work that they do on behalf of Canadian taxpayers. I'd also like to thank the Modern Miracle Network. The Institute of Public Affairs is also a non-profit. It is also funded entirely by its members and supporters and donors. And without those donors and without those supporters, nothing that we did to defeat the carbon tax would at all be possible. Organisations like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, like the IPA, are entirely funded by the goodwill of their supporters, and it's very important that we acknowledge that as often as we can, and thank them for that support. It is no exaggeration to say that the political debate over Australia's carbon tax and emissions trading scheme between 2007 and 2014 was one of the most sustained and dramatic policy debates since Australia's federation in 1901. The carbon tax and climate policy more generally has been implicated in the downfall of at least 4 Commonwealth Party political leaders: John Howard, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard and Malcolm Turnbull. It also could be implicated in 5th if you count Kevin Rudd again. The carbon tax is a big reason why Australia has a revolving door leadership that exceeds Italy's. Elections and careers have been won and lost on climate policy. Today I'm going to briefly tell the story about what happened in Australia. I'll take you through the political history of the carbon tax, how it was introduced in 2012 and repealed in 2014. I'll explain exactly what was introduced, because that's important, how it was received, and what I think are the lessons that other jurisdictions can take from that experience. But first, a word on terminology. I'm going to use the phrase emissions trading scheme, which you might know as a cap and trade scheme, synonymously with the phrase carbon tax. In Australia, this is a very controversial thing to do. What the Gillard government, the Labor government, introduced was a national emissions trading scheme with an initial fixed price period. Gillard had promised during the 2010 election that there would be, quote, no carbon tax under the government I lead. But she admitted later on that the initial fixed price period was effectively a carbon tax. More fundamentally, though, any emissions trading scheme or cap and trade scheme is a tax. There are lots of ways to impose carbon taxation. Just because you impose a tax that you can trade your liabilities with other firms and across borders doesn't mean it's any less of a tax. In fact, I was watching a little clip of what's going on here, and I saw it was being described as a carbon levy. Well, that's cute. But it's a tax. The other thing you should know is, of course, climate policy is a mostly federal responsibility in Australia. The states have their own, sometimes often harmful, often counterproductive climate policies, but the action really is at the Commonwealth in Australia. So here's the story. In 2007, the Conservative Howard government was facing an election that it was very unlikely to win. John Howard had been in power 11 years, and he was up against a Labor Party led by Kevin Rudd, who promised to be a younger, cooler, more socially aware version of Howard. Rudd described himself as a, and I'm going to do big quote marks here, economic conservative, albeit an updated one who was interested in tackling climate change. In that context, Howard promised to introduce an emissions trading scheme. He declared that climate change was the great economic challenge of our time. This was a huge reversal for Howard, who had a long-standing hostility to signing the Kyoto Protocol. Now, Howard lost the 2007 election. He was the first leadership casualty. But for all intents and purposes, his scheme, or the bare bones of that scheme, was the one that the Labor Party introduced when they got into government. Kevin Rudd, the new Prime Minister, had global ambitions, and he saw climate change as an opportunity for Australia to play on the world stage. Australia contributes between 1.1 and 1.5% of global emissions, but we were told that we could lead the world on climate action. Now, stop me if this seems familiar. As soon as he took government, Labor ratified the Kyoto Protocol, of course. The global financial crisis slowed but did not deter Kevin Rudd. Everything was building up to the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference in December 2009. The failure of that Copenhagen conference actually killed the carbon tax, in my view. This might be a very strange thing to say because 3 years later, it was actually legislated and brought into effect. But Rudd had wanted to legislate before Copenhagen. In this, he had the support of the Conservative Liberal Party leader, Malcolm Turnbull, who wanted to remake the Australian Liberal Party into that sort of green Tory mode that David Cameron was pioneering. With the coalition support, the carbon tax would have absolutely passed the Parliament. It is very hard to overemphasise the political media consensus in Australia at that time about the carbon tax. We were told that if Australia didn't immediately pass that tax, we would be an international embarrassment. No serious party could oppose this eminently sensible policy. My think tank, the Institute of Public Affairs, we held a conference in early November 2009 on the economics of climate change. We were ridiculed as conspicuous outliers. We were leaving the mainstream. We would be pariahs in public debate. But not every Liberal supported Malcolm Turnbull's vision of his party. Turnbull's leadership collapsed when Conservatives and free marketeers in the party realised they could not bring themselves to increase taxes on Australians. The IPA, in my view and our view, was instrumental in changing the Liberal Party's view on this. On the eve of Copenhagen, Malcolm Turnbull was disposed as opposition leader by Tony Abbott, who promised to oppose the carbon tax uncompromisingly. Malcolm Turnbull is the second leadership casualty in this story. Nevertheless, Rudd threw everything at Copenhagen. We had 114 people go to the to the Copenhagen conference. The UK only sent 70. As we know, it was a massive failure, that conference. The world failed to get an agreement on binding global climate action. This was a personal humiliation for Rudd. His government drifted and he was rolled is an Australian term, deposed, this happens all the time. I'm going to use the word rolled a lot. He was rolled as Prime Minister by Julia Gillard 6 months later. He was the third leadership casualty. We play politics very, very hard. Julia Gillard ultimately introduced the carbon tax in 2011. I'll outline briefly how it worked. Our cap and trade scheme, the emissions trading scheme, required the 500 largest greenhouse gas emitters in the country to acquire emissions permits, either through trade, auction, or were basically gifted them from the federal government. Now, realising this would potentially devastate Australia's industry, emissions intensive trade exposed firms received free permits. Any claims that an emissions trading scheme is some sort of rational, efficient, market-based mechanism to climate change has to reckon with the fact that it is fundamentally a rent-seeker's fantasy. In the first few years, the carbon tax was set at a fixed price of $23 a tonne. Now, we think that's really big. $50 is insane. In later years, this was supposed to move to a floating price. The carbon tax, you like this, the carbon tax was described as revenue neutral. But all this meant was that the government promised to spend all the money that it received. I can't understand why that's good. I can't understand why you would say it's revenue neutral, we're going to spend it, instead of doing something like pay down the debt. Why is that a good thing? Anyway. How did the carbon tax work? Well, sorry, did the carbon tax work? Let me tell you what it did do. The IPA has estimated that in conjunction with the other climate change policies around at the time, it raised electricity prices by 25%. It cost the Australian economy around $8 or $9 billion a year. Australia's economy is heavily reliant on coal. We have some of the cheapest coal in the world, particularly in Victoria, where I'm from. Energy costs have a massive spillover effect over the entire economy. Our economy is one based on energy. We need energy in order to do all the great things that we do. Now, the Gillard government, despite all this, the Gillard government claimed that there would be no unemployment costs from the carbon tax. Now, let me tell you where they got that idea from. The Commonwealth Treasury's modelling into the carbon tax explicitly assumed there would be no job losses. This wasn't a finding, this was an assumption. The carbon tax failed in another way as well. Australians were told we would lead the world. Australia, leading the world. Yes, Aussie, Aussie, Aussie. Yet another assumption in the Treasury modelling was that the moment our carbon tax went online, other large developed nations would bring their efforts online as well. In fact, Treasury believed, good old Treasury, believed there would be a full-blown international scheme this year, 2016. I think it's worth unpacking the policy. So that's absurd, but we need to talk about the policy logic behind this. The emissions trading scheme was one of the biggest changes to the Australian economy in decades. But the only way it could achieve its goal of holding back climate change would be if it was a spark that set off policy change in the economies that make a real contribution to global emissions. In effect, what this does is it subordinates Australia's economy to our diplomatic efforts. It entrusts our living standards to the Department of Foreign Affairs to go forth and get China and the United States to join us on this wonderful emissions reduction path. Unsurprisingly, this has not been successful. But in this diplomatic service, the government lay a thicket of regulation, subsidisation and revenue churn. Lower income people received compensation. Regulators were empowered. Under our emissions trading legislation, the climate regulator was empowered to enter and search workplaces and compel people to provide self-incriminating evidence, a clear breach of the basic right to silence and fundamental legal rights. Emissions permits themselves are, of course, incredibly volatile financial instruments whose value rests on the regulation and will of Parliament. Enron was deeply involved in emissions trading before it collapsed. Lehman Brothers wanted to be the prime brokerage for emissions permits. But fundamentally, the carbon tax in Australia was toxic politics. Julia Gillard had broken her promise not to introduce a carbon tax. The opposition leader, Tony Abbott, was relentless at prosecuting the case against it, and he promised to axe the tax. During this time, the IPA exposed the burden that the carbon tax had on living standards. We conducted research about its high costs and possible unconstitutionality. We appeared on television and radio hundreds of times. We published full-page ads in the national broadsheet. We distributed 500,000 postcards outlining the cost of the tax. We held 34 events around the country, and we published 2 books and sent IPA staff to the climate conferences in Copenhagen, Durban, Doha and Warsaw. I'm sure you all remember them fondly. The Australian Financial Review wrote that, quote, "Scarcely a day passes without distribution of a pamphlet or point of view about a perfidious new tax to counter a non-existent problem," according to the IPA. For a smallish, hole-in-the-wall Collins Street operation, Collins Street is a street in Melbourne, FYI, the IPA has been making a lot of noise recently and getting traction in a debate that is not going well for those who believe that action needs to be taken now to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Tony Abbott's devastating campaign against Julia Gillard's broken promise made her the 4th leadership casualty over the carbon tax. She was replaced by the Labor leader she had herself replaced, Kevin Rudd. 2 months later, however, Rudd lost the 2013 election to Tony Abbott, and Abbott finally repealed the carbon tax in 2014. Kevin Rudd is the 5th leader. You will notice that Tony Abbott is not our Prime Minister at the moment. He was rolled again afterwards. This is just how we play. It's great. Preparing these marks, however, has been a little bit of a trip into nostalgia for me. It's no exaggeration to say that the carbon tax is just not on the political agenda anymore. In theory, it's still Labor Party policy, but they don't really talk about it. Malcolm Turnbull, as I said, is once more leader of the Liberal Party and now Prime Minister. But the appetite for a carbon tax is so low that he dare not propose anything other than perhaps there'll be a price on carbon as early as 2030. It is widely understood that in an economy the size of Australia, and in the absence of any world effort, a carbon tax will lead to little more than slowed growth and the shift of emissions-intensive industries overseas. So what should we do about climate change? The choice, in my view, is this. We can keep trying to mitigate climate change, that is, reduce energy consumption through tax and regulation, or we can look at how to adapt. To embrace adaptation would to embrace market-based economic reform more generally. We'd take away barriers to investment and development so that the economy could smoothly adjust to changes in climate, the economy, global markets. It would mean the liberalisation of planning laws, the abolition of subsidies that keep, for instance, farmers farming marginal land. It would mean freeing up insurance regulation so firms could properly price risk. It would mean lowering property taxes so people could move out of unprofitable areas. I didn't invent this argument. It came from a report into climate adaptation policies by Australia's Productivity Commission in 2012. As far as I can tell, I'm the only person to have read that report. The environmentalists who claim to be the only ones who take climate change seriously don't want to talk about adaptation. But I'll conclude with one point. To oppose carbon tax does not let governments off the hook. Our job now is to convince state and Commonwealth governments in Australia to pursue economic reform. Because these same policies that make a country rich, that is, low taxes, little red tape and the rule of law, are the same policies we need to tackle any changes in the climate, whether that change is natural or human caused. A carbon tax, by reducing living standards and tying our economies up in legislation and regulation, is exactly the opposite of what we need. Thank you very much.
So was there any turning point then in the campaign where you sort of knew that the tides were turning in your favour, where you knew that the tax was going to be repealed?
Fundamentally, my view is, as I said in the talk, the moment it became clear that there was going to be no binding international agreement, it also became clear that this policy was doomed. Now, that happened in 2009. I'm not sure the population or the political class thought that it was doomed at that time, but in retrospect, you can see everything falling down around it. Tony Abbott becoming leader on a pledge to axe the tax. Kevin Rudd's leadership sort of in a slow collapse after he failed to be the great global leader that he thought he could be. Fundamentally, once the justification for the policy disappeared, global climate action, it just was on a hiding to nothing. And this is why I'm really struck, I'm struck twofold. I love talking about global warming when it's negative 18 outside. I think that's great. But this tour was arranged before Donald Trump's election victory. And surely that kills a carbon tax in Canada, anywhere in Canada. I don't understand why, if your major trading partner is the United States, one of the biggest carbon emitters is the United States, they're not going to do anything about it. Why you would be self-harming in order to, what, convince them otherwise? Convince Donald Trump otherwise?
Exactly why we're sending him to Ottawa as well. Deliver this message of a little bit of carbon tax sanity. Also, has anybody else noticed his nutcracker socks? Just a little fun fact about Christmas.
Eccentric socks. They're a good replacement for personality, I feel.
Very, very Christmassy. We can still say Christmas. Okay, so something that's talked about here a lot by the politicians in Alberta in particular is this concept of social license, that if we have a carbon tax, then we can get our oil to market. And without a carbon tax, then that's never going to happen for us. Now, a lot of us, I think, in this room think that that's sort of a fluffy, rhetorical fantasy concept that doesn't mean much. But it does resonate with some groups of people. So what would you say to those kinds of arguments?
I love this idea. There's a social license. There are actual licenses. There are thousands of actual licenses for these firms. So I do a lot of work in minerals regulation in Australia. There's a mine in the Pilbara, so the north of Western Australia. They calculated how many licenses that they had to fill out before they could start construction. 4,000 licenses. This idea that there's another social license on top of that. Basically, all the government is saying, oh, by the way, you fill out all those forms and we get a veto. Just at the end of it. Oh, yeah, no, you can't do that. They never demonstrate that there's a social license. This is just something that politicians invented, environmentalists invented, because even though there are so many restrictions on development, there is so much red tape, occasionally a mine gets through. Oh, no. How devastating. That's a violation of the social license. This is pernicious, and this is the idea that there is a social license behind business operation is fundamentally anti-enterprise, it's anti-market capitalism, because what it's saying is the government can just decide off no other evidence than feelings that you're not allowed to do something. I can't imagine anything worse for an economy than that.
Well, that's, yeah.
Excuse me, just let me calm down for a second.
It's a frustrating concept because, again, it's how do you fight against something that's sort of a rhetorical fantasy concept. So another question that I wanted to ask, because one of the main lines of defense from the government against carbon tax opponents, like the people in this room, is that well, the carbon tax is only going to impact the wealthy. It's not going to impact low-income people, and that's one of the many similarities between the Australia carbon tax and what we're seeing here in Alberta. Is part of their revenue neutrality. That's not really revenue neutrality. Is giving subsidies to low-income people. Now we have concerns from our perspective that they don't cover the whole cost of a carbon tax, and that they're heavily weighted by, they're based on averages, which are heavily weighted by the city. So people in rural areas might be hit harder. How did those subsidies work out for low-income folks in Australia? Did it cover the full cost? Did they feel like they were being completely compensated? How did that play out?
So we had low-income compensation. I'm not sure it was very politically effective. People liked receiving money, obviously, but I'm not convinced that they felt, well, this is a compensation for the fact that I'm getting extra, that my products cost more, or that sort of thing. We in Australia, in our debates about our welfare system, we've had a lot of discussions about welfare churn. The idea that the government will be taking money from you on the one hand and giving money back on the other. People don't trust the government to do that. They know that the government takes money off the top. But fundamentally, it's not just about those individual low-income earners who might find that their electricity bill has gone up, because a carbon tax does enormous damage to the structure of the economy. It disfavours energy-intensive production. It disfavours the best things that Canada or Australia could do with their economy. It disfavours those industries that we do best in the world. And if we're starting to favour the industries that we don't do best in the world, that's going to have a long-term impact on living standards. Happily, we only had it for 2 years. But some of the decisions that companies had to make in that period, big capital investments with a 10 and 20-year time frame, they're not the decisions you would have made without the carbon tax there. They're not the decisions you would have made if we weren't deliberately sabotaging our economy.
So as I mentioned, many of us here are actively campaigning against the carbon tax. Coming out of your campaign, knowing that it was so successful and feeling good, and this being your nostalgia tour, do you have any sort of tried and true universal tips for opponents who are campaigning against the carbon tax that maybe we can take away as tangible things that we can do here in Alberta to fight it?
You have to fire up the Conservative politicians. Originally, as I said, this was bipartisan policy. The Liberal Party supported the carbon tax originally. We managed to convince the Liberal Party not to do so, because we managed to convince Liberal Party grassroots members that that was a huge violation of the principles in which they joined the Liberal Party in the first place. They didn't join the Liberal Party to raise taxes. I know this is a very funny thing to say in Canada. They didn't join the Liberal Party to raise taxes. Yeah, they did. But in Australia, the Liberal Party has an ethos of free enterprise, and we were able to demonstrate that the carbon tax was a massive and unprecedented violation of those principles. Liberal Party members managed to convince backbenchers, managed to convince ministers, and ultimately ministers and backbenchers rolled the party leader who wanted to introduce it. You can, unfortunately, the IPA can't pass legislation. You have to convince politicians. We wouldn't pass much, you can imagine. But you have to convince political leaders. And if you've got a good leader who tells a clear message that the carbon tax is a violation of everything that the conservative side of politics stands for, you can make real headways in both the debate and, of course, you can make real change at the legislative level.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a message well received here. We need to keep on the opposition parties to ensure that they stay clear about their opposition to the carbon tax.
And the brilliance of Tony Abbott, he had one message. It was axe the tax. Mm-hmm. The carbon tax was damaging our economy for no point. Mm-hmm. And he said that day after day after day. And it made sense to people, and ultimately he won the election. Yeah, and you brought out that silent majority. Well, I have one final question, and then we're going to turn it over to the lovely folks in the audience. Given that carbon taxes we know they're all pain and no gain. We know that they're unpopular, even if people aren't necessarily being brought up in the media as opposing the carbon tax. We know that silent majority is there. And yet we saw Australia bring in a carbon tax. We're bringing in a carbon tax here in Canada. Other countries are discussing it. I see this as a real hit to our competitiveness in Canada and in Alberta in particular. So how do you see it sort of when you're thinking globally about this sort of global experiment with carbon taxes? How do you think it's going to play out in the long term? And do you think that it's going to be a real hit to countries like Canada in terms of our competitiveness? I hope it's going to be good for Australia. I'm sure it will now, yeah. Like, you're welcome to invest in Australia. That's all I'm saying. We're actually seeing this, and I'm sure, I know this is being discussed in Canada. We're seeing the proposals by Donald Trump, for instance, to cut the corporate tax rate to 15%, which is incredible, to cut red tape, do a 1 in 2 out model for regulation. We're starting to think this is going to have a real impact on Australia's competitiveness, and this is going to spark, I hope this will spark reform in Australia. Fundamentally, we're all in the same business here. We're trying to attract scarce foreign investment. We're trying to attract it from each other. We're trying to attract it from emerging markets, China and India and so forth. We compete against each other for investment. What makes one country rich, it's not a competition insofar as we can both get rich together. But if one country harms itself, if one country makes it unprofitable to invest, then that money is going to go elsewhere. It's going to go to Australia. So in a funny way, I'm betraying my countrymen by trying to help you out here. But well, we very much. It wouldn't be the first time. All right. So with that, let's get some questions from the audience. Do we have a mic that can go? No? Okay, there is a mic over. Let's just use very loud voices. Maybe. Let's try that. And I'll try to repeat the question so everybody can hear it. Oh, there is one over there? Just make sure it works. Do you want to just test?
I'm doing my filled on.
Works better if you turn it on.
I'm a maritimer. These are harder to work out. We quit working a long time ago.
Yeah.
Hello?
We're back to
This is Canadian self-deprecation. Oh, there we go. Okay, so if anybody has a question, maybe Kevin, you want to go around and just over there.
Good stuff. So I'm a student, and when we're at my age, things are very black and white. And the unfortunate thing for many of my peers in this case is that if you talk in any degree about being opposed to a carbon tax or anything in that vein, you're immediately in the category of anti-science. You're opposed to everything which anyone who has any education is, holds dear. So how do you communicate the message given that it's often received in that way? How do you communicate that you're not opposed to science, but that this is still something which is important?
Yeah, I mean, and we're talking at cross purposes here. So young people and a lot of people in the public will say it's a black and white issue. If you think climate change is real, then you need a carbon tax. If you don't think it's real, then that's why you oppose the carbon tax. But there's another black and white issue. Does public policy work? Does it achieve the goal that it's been set? And the carbon tax doesn't do that. So it's wonderful to talk about the science. It's wonderful to debate the science. It's wonderful that politicians are interested in science. But politicians need to be aware that public policy is designed to do specific things. And if it doesn't do that, if it doesn't inspire international action on climate change mitigation policies, then it has failed in its purpose. So many politicians and so many in the political class want sort of virtue signalling legislation. I don't think that's what legislation is for. I don't think that's why we have a tax system, to share our values to the rest of the world, to suggest to people what we feel about science. I want public policy that states its goal and achieves its goal. And if it doesn't achieve its goal, it needs to be repealed.
Here, here.
You can also start a Generation Screwed Club on your campus if you haven't already. That's our student movement, 27 campus clubs across Canada. You'll find that there's a majority of campuses as well of people who don't want to come out. So talk about that later. All right.
Chris, that was a great segue to my question. Is in Australia you have renewable energy standards as well, so at the state level, and I'm guessing that you may have some comments on those in terms of whether they're accomplishing their stated objectives and what they're doing.
Well, they're certainly bringing in renewable energy, I'll tell you that. It's not all flowers and sunshine, although I imagine you think Australia is like that at the moment. So even though we got rid of the carbon tax, we still have a lot of climate change policies. And a lot of those climate change policies are quite harmful. They're quite expensive. They raise electricity prices. When we cut the carbon tax, electricity prices didn't go down 25% because there's a lot of other things. We have, for instance, a renewable energy target, which is a federal policy. We have all sorts of renewable energy subsidisation schemes. We have energy efficiency standards, which make it more expensive to build homes, to buy, refrigerators and so on and so forth. And they're all very, very harmful. My view is that I prefer the status quo that we have now to that plus the carbon tax, and we're certainly a lot better off. But they are causing problems and they are raising the price of electricity. The renewable energy target's an interesting one because we have had some really serious issues with renewable energy in South Australia. South Australia has put the most money into renewable energy. They've transitioned a very, very large amount of their network onto renewable energy. And South Australia also has some of the highest demand for air conditioning. In the heat waves in South Australia, you can have days that is 46 plus. And if you have days above 40, for like a couple of days in a row, the bricks of your house heat up. There is nothing you can do about that. It just gets really, really hot. South Australia has it the worst in the country. South Australia was entirely disconnected from the national energy market a couple of months ago, and again a couple of weeks ago, because now that it's put so much money into renewable energy, it has the most unreliable energy network in the country. This is a long-standing Labor government. It's made a lot of waves about being the most progressive government in the country. It's the most forward-thinking on climate change, but it can't keep the lights on, and it can't keep the air conditioners on, and that's a huge problem.
Didn't manufacturers move out of Australia?
Oh, yeah. But that's been a long-term thing, I have to say. They're not coming back.
I want to respond to the first two questions that were asked, and then ask another question. First of all, with regards to the first question, the carbon tax is nothing but a lazy political way to address this problem. It's the way politicians do things because they don't want to do things. They don't want to make decisions that might be wrong, although this is the worst one there is. But from there, what they need to be doing is, and this gets to the second question, is we need to address the places. If this CO2 issue is an issue, then let's address it directly, okay? I go to quite a few conferences, and this topic is often a topic at these conferences. One of the things that comes out of these conferences is that we will probably never get this CO2 problem under control in the world until we get population growth under control. And the two areas of the world where we need to get the population growth under control are the two areas of the world that are contributing the most to the pollution. Any suggestions on where we can go there? We've already offered to trade Trudeau, but nobody else.
I think population is good for the world. I think population gives us the creativity, the ultimately the economic growth and the living standards that we want. And I don't. Thank you. To sit there and say that we'll solve climate change if we shrink humanity, I think that's really counterproductive. Certainly not what I stand for.
Yeah, my name is Don Mazicki, and I'm from the Great Valley area, but then live in kind of Oilfield. But what I want to know is when you had your tax repeal, was there any polarization in any of the states, which I think that happened up here quite a bit? Do you have any states that are polarized to keep it, or pro-government, or where was your biggest power coming from to the removal of it, or was there anybody for it in the first place?
Yeah, like in Canada, we have more left-leaning and more right-leaning states. Victoria is a more left-leaning state, and more supporters of the carbon tax there. The opposition really came from Western Australia and Queensland. Western Australia and Queensland have a really substantial influence over the Liberal Party at the moment. More conservative members of Parliament, much more conservative electorate. Conservative in the sense that they're much more free market. They want the government off their back, particularly Western Australia. And so they weren't big fans of basically, inner city Melbourne and inner city Sydney dictating their power prices. So there is that polarisation, absolutely. But again, we're talking about uniformly federal policies here. So it all gets mixed up once you go to Canberra.
Sir, thanks for coming to Alberta. And Ruth Graham once said, God often does the impossible by motivating the unwilling to do the impossible. And we're all aware of the problem here, but what would you say that the one or two most important things that the average person can do? It's easy to say what the politicians should be doing, but what should ordinary people like myself and the people standing around me, what are the one or two or three things that we could do that would be most likely to get rid of the carbon tax?
So I love the fact that there was a carbon tax protest. I thought that was fantastic. We had carbon tax protests as well. We shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that protests themselves are what changes things. But what protests do is they show politicians that there is a support for them to follow through their principles, to follow through their low tax values. And they know that they will be backed up by a group in the community that supports them. When we had carbon tax protests, they were very influential in changing the opinion of the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party members or Liberal Party parliamentarians realised that members of the Liberal Party were in these protests, protesting against a policy that the Liberal Party themselves supported. They realised they were way outside what their members expected, what Conservative voters expected, and I think that really helped inspire them to change. So petitions are very valuable like that. Protests are very valuable like that. Letters to the editor, if you can have the opportunity to write a newspaper column or something like that, it all really helps because the politicians who aren't brilliant at reading what the public is thinking, you're giving them information. You're giving them a signal that there are people out there who will support you doing the right thing. Because otherwise all they talk to is the media, and they're uniformly supportive.
Perhaps time for another shameless plug. If you're on our Canadian Taxpayers Federation email list, We will let you know on certain days when, you know, all of us are going to call a minister's office, or we're all going to start calling your local MLA, or we're all going to email, or we're all going to show up at an event or a rally or a public consultation session of the government, whatever it might be. There's power in numbers, so taking all of those things and multiplying it is what we try to do at the CTF. So I'm sure that most of you are on our mailing list already, but if you're not, certainly sign up and encourage your friends to do so.
Amber, ready from the... Yep.
Yeah.
All right, just say it loud, Amber. I'll repeat it.
Amber Reddy from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. So recently our Premier said that she never indicated $30 a ton was the upper limit of where it could go in the future. And we always point to BC. You know, BC has such a great carbon tax. But in BC recently, a panel suggested that they should raise the carbon tax $10 per year until 2050, when the tax reaches $350 a ton. Do you think that where the carbon tax price is right now is enough to get people try to get rid of it? Or do you think that when the true intent behind the policy, if the real price it has to be to affect the change they want, would be something large?
I'll just repeat the question quickly. So, Notley recently said, from Amber Ruddy from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Notley recently that $30. They never said $30 was the upper limit of carbon tax, and so now she's going to $50 in BC. I think originally $30. They had a panel recently that said it should be raised $10 every year until it reached $350. And so I was asking, you know, is a $50 carbon tax enough right now to mobilize the public against the carbon tax, or does it need to be this true intent of an absolutely ridiculously high carbon tax before people start paying attention?
Look, $23 a tonne was enough in Australia. But, I mean, they're right in a way, because what they want to do is decarbonise the economy. So they want to get rid of all greenhouse gas emissions. So you would just keep hiking it up until it reaches 350 and no one uses greenhouse gas emitting energy at all. That's the plan. That's their intent. In a funny way, you see these politicians introducing $23 a tonne, $30 a tonne. You know that's not what they want. You know that's not the intention. The end goal is decarbonisation. Getting rid of all greenhouse gas emissions. And it's really nice when you hear them say, like, yeah, that's what we want to, no more. $350 a tonne. Make it $1,000. I mean, that's what they want.
Maybe for our purposes, we just need to remind people that these are the true intents of these policies. Carbon tax are designed to increase.
Yeah, the point is to increase the cost of energy. And they try to hide that, oh, you can have compensation. No, it's very rational, all that. But they're trying to stop you using the cheapest energy you have available. That's what they want. That's the policy's intent.
So, what's the alternative?
Sorry. Just 1 second, we're going to go over here first. And then
Sorry, my name is Lorene Sherman. I'm with Starting Incorporated. I'm a businesswoman and I'm a scientist. Now, as a scientist, I look at this carbon tax and I wonder what about the carbon capture. We obviously have many trees, and so there's sinks. Where does that come into play for Alberta? The other part is, in the carbon tax with Kyoto Protocol, there were many things like multiplicative like cycles, and I don't hear that. So I'm looking and I'm trying to figure out where the actual roots to this came into play, because if you look at global change, or excuse me, the climate change, you'd be looking at methane, you'd be looking at all these poisonous gases. Why are we picking on carbon? I just don't see that.
So to sum up, so Lorraine, the scientist, is wondering about do the carbon sinks in Canada? We've got lots of forest, carbon sinks, farmland as well. Do those come into play at all? And why are we specifically focusing in on carbon emissions when there are so many different contributors?
I will make a point, I mean, I don't know the Albertan situation, but I will make a point based on the Australian experience. Governments for well more than a decade in Australia have used this idea that our forests, our native forests, can be a carbon sink. And what they do when they do that is they basically lock in vast areas of land so that you can't do anything with it. Some of that is public land, but a great deal of it is private land. So we have these native vegetation laws. I'm not sure whether there's a parallel in Canada. Native vegetation laws that prevent farmers from chopping down trees on their own property. Because farmers can't farm without chopping down trees, it's basically expropriating their property from them with no compensation. There's a very, very clever constitutional trick that the government uses to avoid having to pay compensation. But fundamentally, this is what happens. The government says, well, we need X million hectares of native forest to be a carbon sink. Therefore, you cannot cut down trees or you can only cut down a certain percentage of trees or so on and so forth. And it's been a huge regulatory nightmare. It's a really substantial barrier to agriculture in Australia. And Australia has these fantasies that it's going to be the food bowl of Asia. Well, we're not allowed to chop down trees to do so.
I've been asked to waive this to indicate that I have a comment or a question. I think I'll just comment on the lady scientist. There was an article published in the Financial Post fairly recently that indicated that Canada was a net carbon sink and that we have a huge volume of forest which absorb way more than the volumes of carbon dioxide that we emit. So that's one major difference between us and Australia. The other comment is that our climate panel essentially used the image of 3 integrated assessment models to come up with a social cost of carbon, which they equate to a carbon tax. But 2 of those models, or as what they said, they only show the costs but no benefits. And only one model, which will tell you is called the fund model, has costs and benefits, and it shows using the extremely exaggerated UN estimate of climate sensitivity shows that Canada always benefits from emissions, and those benefits continue to increase through the 21st century. So do you think that would be a good line to use in order to get rid of the carbon tax in Alberta? And my second point is that the UN panel grossly exaggerates climate sensitivity by failure to include the effects of urbanization on temperatures and the millennium warming cycle, as a lot of the warming recently has been recovery from the Little Ice Age.
So the Financial Post had an article showing that Canada is carbon sink and that we actually absorb more carbon than we emit. The government's model when creating the carbon tax was fundamentally flawed. Essentially, it took into account more of our, it didn't include the benefits of our emissions. So would there be a benefit then to us maybe talking about the benefits of the use of, I know Modern Miracle Network, our sponsor here, talks a lot about the benefits of the use of hydrocarbons and how that's advanced society. Do you think that should be a part of the debate at all?
There's 2 definitions of the word benefit here. So Modern Miracle Network is absolutely right to talk about the benefits of using hydrocarbons and of using cheap energy, because it makes us richer, it gets people out of poverty. We talk about shipping coal to India particularly, where 100 million people are in energy poverty. That's really, really important. As to whether a warming planet will help Canada, it probably will. Or it potentially could. Some countries are going to lose, and some countries are going to win out of if the planet warms 1 degree, 2 degrees, whatever it is. I don't think, however, that's going to be a very compelling political argument, because this isn't about whether Canada wins or whether Australia loses. Australia's definitely going to be a loser in this case, I have to say. We don't want it to be hotter. But that's not really what we're talking about when we have these arguments. We're talking about a moral statement that we have to prevent it for the world. That's what our opponents are arguing. That's what the governments that support these sort of policies are arguing. They're signalling to the world that they are taking a global stand on a moral matter. Kevin Rudd declared climate change the greatest moral challenge of our time. He knew what he was doing when he did that, because he knew that he couldn't justify a carbon tax on the basis of Australia's contribution to global emissions. So I think it's very important to keep what we're talking about on the practical policy level. I think it's very important. I think it's important to talk about the science, but I also think it's important to have other arguments. And the IPA talks about the science sometimes, but it's important to have arguments about, regardless of what you think of the science, is this good public policy? And my view is it is absolutely not.
Hi, Peter McCaffrey from the Manning Centre. One of the biggest problems we have in Alberta and probably in Canada is that a lot of the large energy companies have come out in favour of the carbon tax because they think there's an economic benefit to them of getting on the good side of the government, because then they'll get political favours when the limits come in, and they'll be the ones to get the allocations and the subsidies and things like that. So A, how do we counter that? And B, how do we convince those companies that, guess what, they're going to be next? Like you said, the plan is just to eliminate it all entirely. And how do we get them to focus on the long term rather than the short term?
So the question was about how there are big oil and gas companies that have come out in support in the carbon tax in Alberta, particularly because they think that it's good to play nice with the government, and because they're going to be on the receiving end of a lot of what we call corporate welfare, big subsidies, which actually in Alberta, I'll add, is the largest use of the carbon tax revenue. So how do we convince them that that argument is flawed, and also that they will be next? Even if the government supports or is giving them subsidies in the short term, that there will be next as well.
I mean, that's right, and we see all these emissions trading schemes in Australia had free permits. It is this enormous rent-seeking opportunity. It's enormous opportunity for that sort of legal corruption that characterises so much of our contemporary economic system. That's a huge problem. Now, we had this particularly strongly at the same time we introduced a carbon tax, of course. We introduced a mining tax. The mining tax was exactly that. It was a deliberate stitch-up with the big mining companies, the big Australian mining companies, BHP and Rio Tinto, in order to, they negotiated with the federal government to get a good deal out of it, and it completely screwed all the small miners. It completely stuffed them up. And so the small miners are out there trying to protest while BHP and Rio have gone dead silent and are just, taking trips to Canberra and having wonderful coffees with the Prime Minister. These policies when you introduce these sorts of policies, you create massive opportunities for rent seeking. Now, whether the big companies are eventually the victims of that, they will be if the cost keeps going up. But the problem for consumers, the problem for individual Australians and individual Canadians, is that that's not always obvious that these guys are getting huge benefits out of a regulatory system. It's going to harm individual consumers, individual employees, individual workers, when you've got a big government and big business working together to rig the system in their favour.
Yeah, you certainly don't see a lot of small companies in Alberta coming out in favour of the carbon tax. Pretty solidly against it, even on the resource side. So we've got time for one more question, and then of course people are welcome to stay and schmooze and have some snacks and drinks and chat.
Folks, my name is Todd Beasley. I'm the Managing Director of the Alberta-wide Rally Movement. You might have heard of us. On November 5th, we held simultaneous rallies across the province in every metropolitan centre, and fundamentally is in opposition to the carbon tax. We have a petition that we're signing, which is bona fide. It's been passed by the Legislative Assembly. We're asking for support for at least 500,000 people in Alberta, but we want to go and support it to the standing Legislative Assembly, making a simple statement Ms. Notley, you do not have the support of people on this tax. That's my fundamental statement, but I've got to say something else. I am also working with the Saskatchewan government on the Boundary Dam carbon capture program. If you folks haven't heard of this, please go home tonight, punch it in your computer, because quite frankly, folks, we can have our cake and eat it too on this environmental issue. There's technology that exists that is removing city levels of emissions. It has been, the hard lifting has been done by Brad Wall's government. Let's have a round of applause for Brad Wall. Fundamentally, what this technology is doing is it is solving the emissions problem at the power plant level. It is a mistake in Alberta to shut power down from a technical and economic and environmental perspective. Not one person needs to lose their job. Not one community needs to be devastated. We can unlock a king's ransom for Alberta and her treasury. In 2007, the Alberta Energy Research Institute and the Alberta Research Council commissioned a major $40 million study which said CCS EOR technology is the answer for Alberta, and the conclusion of that report was this: we could take 100% of the emissions of our valuable asset, the oil sands, we could put those emissions into the Redwater Formation, 40 years of storage. When we're done that, we could then go ahead and put it into the Cardium. The enhanced oil recovery that we would get out of this is absolutely a king's ransom for Alberta's treasury. Sir, you talked earlier that this is ultimately about people believing in global warming. I say no, it is not. This is all about tax. This is all about wealth redistribution, because if it was about solving the environmental problems, the answer exists right next door in Estevan, Saskatchewan. This government is not interested in even listening to the story. Sorry, that was a statement.
Okay, so that wasn't a question, but do you want to make any final words maybe before we wrap up?
No, it's only to say that it's been a real honour to come down here. I hope that this sort of discussion is helpful. I'm very happy to talk to any of you afterwards and provide advice such as I can give it. Australia and Canada are very, very similar countries in so many ways. We're geographically similar. We're culturally similar. We've got roughly the same political system. When we look for international examples of how to do things, we look to Canada. I hope that in this case, when you look for a way to kill these sorts of economy-damaging carbon tax, you can look to Australia as well.